I'm Deanne Erdman with Baylor College of Medicine's Options Program, and this is part of a review for the Life Science Teacher Certification exam. Today I'd like to discuss the interrelationship or interdependence of life and environmental systems. Two major things that we deal with in biology on a consistent basis throughout the course are evolution and ecology. An important cause of evolutionary change is the interaction of organisms with their environment. So events that occur in ecological time translate to evolutionary time. In environmental systems, we deal with organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, and the biosphere. And I'd like to focus on ecosystems. Biology is such a vocabulary-intense course that we try to deal with it in the best way that we can. And many times, as you take a look at this list of starting vocabulary terms that we need to be conversant with in ecology, you probably think, I know all those terms. And your students may say the same thing because they're for the most part, things that they've seen before. So it's always a nice idea to do a little bit of pre-assessment. And in doing this, you begin the process of it becoming more than just vocabulary to memorize, but vocabulary also just to become a normal part of the conversation and the discussions of the topic. One idea that a lot of teachers use and that I've used in the past and that has many applications is that you can go to your local hardware store and buy a big sheet of plywood that has the whiteboard facing on it. It's fairly inexpensive. If you're not handy at home, don't have a skill saw or a circular saw to cut it apart, they'll do that for you at the hardware store many times. And maybe if you cut them into, say, 10 by 12 or 12 by 12 little squares, you can pass these out to your students and give them a marker. And so as you have this vocabulary up on the overhead or on the board, it's pretty easy to say, to give several definitions and have the students choose what you're actually defining. For example, if you started with environment and ecology and you gave some discussion of both and asked, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the environment? Are you talking about ecology? You can get a quick assessment by having them write down which one they think and holding their boards up. And then go a step further. The ones that have it correct, then deal with some questioning of those students and ask them why they chose that, what their thinking process was. And without really realizing it and fairly painlessly, they begin to think about these as more than just vocabulary terms. And also, when you can state a definition for something in other ways, that's when you truly understand it. When you read off a definition and 5 hands go up in the room and want to read theirs to you and ask you if that's correct, then if they can't tell from what you've said and what they've written, then they're not understanding the term. So it's a good assessment tool. You might, before we start, just pause this for a minute and just yourself see if you could come up with a definition. Many times you look at the list and go, oh, I know all of those, but then when you're really pressed and put on the spot to come up with a definition, it's a little harder than you think, and you find the holes in your own learning. When we look at the difference between environment and ecology, of course, environment is all the surroundings that an organism finds themselves in, the physical surroundings, the soil, the temperature, the precipitation, plus all the organisms that it interacts with. Ecology is the study of how those organisms interact with not only the biological, but the physical environment. Ernest Haeckel coined the term ecology in 1866. Biotic versus abiotic. Biotic is the living portion of the environment, and abiotic is the non-living. It might be the soil, it might be temperature, it might be nutrients. It could be severe disturbances that happen in the environment. That's part of the abiotic function. Populations are all the members of the same species. For example, you might have a population of ground squirrels and then a different population of rock squirrels. All of the squirrels in the area are not necessarily one population if they're different species. communities are all of the interacting populations within a particular area. So if I were looking at all of the different populations of birds making up a particular community, I might look at the cardinals and the Carolina chickadees and the sparrows, etc., in a particular area. Then an ecosystem are all of the interacting communities and physical factors of the environment for a given area. And it might be small, it might be large. And we're going to explore that quite a bit in this series. The biosphere is the part of the earth that supports life, and so it's, I guess, our largest ecosystem. And I want you to remember that the earth is really a closed system with respect to chemicals. It's open with regard to energy from the sun, but as far as chemicals, we have to recycle those. Ecosystems, all the members of a community, along with their physical and chemical environments, is a good definition for ecosystems. And it's a natural association of species, not some kind of contrived situation. And it's built on feeding structure. The size can be, you can talk about the ecosystem of a particular aquarium, or it can be a large region like the Mojave Desert or the Chesapeake Bay. And one of the measures that we look at in ecosystems is that of diversity. And as a rule, the more diversity we find within an ecosystem, the more stable it is and the more productive it is. An ecosystem becomes pretty fragile when there's just very few species, because then the feeding structure is so it's so fragile. If something happens to one species, then directly you have a number of other species that will fall by the wayside. But if there's an interconnected feeding structure, if one species dies out, then you might another species may be able to take up the slack, and the ecosystem pretty much remain intact. They're dynamic. The ecosystems, remember, the energy flow is open. We mentioned that a minute ago. The sun energy comes in as light and leaves as heat, and it's replenished. The chemical cycling, however, is closed. So we have to depend on the recycling of these different chemical elements that make up organisms, and there is a finite reserve of those. So sometimes we forget that they're not endless. Sometimes it might be good to think about the Earth as a spaceship. While the energy from the sun can power that spaceship, what we have is what we have. Another thing that we look at in ecosystems is the change over time or succession. And you have to remember that if you have some founding members in a particular ecosystem, that they in turn produce a change to that ecosystem. Maybe they enrich the soil, or maybe they deplete the soil. Maybe a new organism comes in and changes the balance, or one species leaves and it changes the balance. You'll get a little feel for this in your classroom when sometimes you have the dynamics of a class all set and you get a new student. It's amazing what the introduction of another person can do in the classroom. And of course, in an ecosystem, we would be talking about the introduction of a new species, or maybe even a new variety within a species can offer some adaptations that gives it some advantage or some disadvantage and make change. Mutations, disease, those kinds of things also can affect. So remember that the ecosystems are in a continual state of change. Biomes are just widespread terrestrial ecosystems. And notice that I said terrestrial because sometimes biomes have been used to talk about not only terrestrial areas but also aquatic. But biomes are described by the amount of rainfall, by the temperature, and by their dominant vegetation. And so we don't include aquatic areas in this group when we talk about biomes. There's many ways to classify them. I picked out, I think, 7 or so of the more common descriptions of biomes. There's subsets of these, and there's other descriptions, but in general you begin to get the idea of what we're talking about when we try to describe these major land areas. Tropical rainforests, of course, are something that come to everybody's mind when we think about a biome. There's such a rich and diverse area. They contain almost half of the Earth's known species, usually in excess of 350 centimeters of rain a year or precipitation, and that leads to pretty poor soil quality because of the leaching that occurs. So most of the nutrients are tied up in the tremendous biomass and the vegetation that you find within a tropical rainforest. Also think about the size. When you think about a tropical rainforest, you think about large leaves, maybe banana plants, and very heavy vines with big leaf surfaces. And part of that is indicative of the amount of moisture that's in that particular environment, and that they have to deal with recycling that moisture, or the plants could just simply rot away. Savannas are dry grasslands. They're one of the characteristics are long periods of drought. They have very scattered trees, usually wind, and again the wet and dry seasons. Deserts, you think about deserts, the most influential feature of a desert, of course, is the lack of moisture. And the organisms you find in a desert are adapted to that situation. The saguaro cactus have pleats in them so that they can, when there is a little bit of moisture, take great advantage of that and be able to expand. Very limited modified leaves so that they don't lose much water at all. A desert dweller, the kangaroo rat, it doesn't drink water at all, but instead it obtains all its moisture from seeds that it eats. So organisms in these different environments you're going to find have very specialized kinds of adaptations. And while you might not find exactly the same species from one desert to another desert, you'll find organisms that are adapted in similar kinds of ways. Temperate grasslands, these are sometimes what we refer to as the prairies. They have very fertile soil, and one important characteristic of prairies is the effect of grazing animals and also fire play a part in keeping shrubs and trees out of those environments and maintaining the big grasslands. Of course, we've converted a lot of the grasslands into farmland because of the rich, fertile soil, so we've lost a lot of our natural grasslands. The temperate deciduous forests, these are our hardwoods, and as the name says, most of the trees are deciduous, losing their leaves in the winter. Many times in these kinds of biomes you find hot summers and cold winters, but you have a fairly adequate rain supply. The coniferous forests are the cone-bearing. You find spruce and hemlock and the giant redwoods. Generally poor soil, and part of that is because these forests are such old growth forests that a lot of the nutrients are tied up in the dominant vegetation. Look at the adaptation of some of these cone-bearing trees. They sort of are a pyramid shape, and some of that is so that because there's so much snowfall, it keeps the branches from breaking. The snow just simply falls and slides down like it would on a sloped roof. The needles are thin so that there's not much moisture loss as opposed to the broadleaves that we saw in the tropical rainforest. And then the last one that I listed was the tundra. And the tundra, of course, has a permanently frozen subsoil. And what this does is prevent large shrubs and trees from growing, not only because of the harsh wind and the cold conditions, but because the roots can't penetrate through that frozen subsoil. You find mosses, you find lichens, and you find a lot of grasses in the tundra. Let's take a look at the aquatic ecosystems, and they cover about 3/4 of the Earth's surface. When we're looking at aquatic ecosystems, some of the things that we look for when we're describing them, we look at the depth of the water, whether there's flow or current circulation, the chemical composition, salinity of the water, how much light penetrates, and of course the temperature. Those are all important characteristics when you're looking at aquatic ecosystems. In freshwater, we have lakes and flowing water. In flowing water, you think of streams and creeks and rivers, but one important thing about those is they change quite a bit as you move in distance from the source of the original source of the water, because it's going to go through lots of different kinds of soil. There's going to be erosion, different kinds of plant life and aquatic life as it goes, possibly even traverses through different kinds of terrestrial biomes. So there's a lot of change that occurs in these flowing bodies of water. The wetlands, swamps and marshes and bogs are very productive ecosystems, but they're also big areas of water storage, and human activity, unfortunately, is bad about thinking of some of these areas as not useful and filling them in and draining them, which in turn creates or sets off a whole set of unpleasant reactions in other kinds of biomes. Estuaries are especially important as breeding grounds. Estuaries are where freshwater and saltwater meet, and you can see that there might be a lot of fluctuation in these. Let's say we've had real heavy rains in a particular land area, and as that water drains off through the river systems and flushes into these estuaries, it's going to reduce the salinity tremendously. In times of drought, when there's not as much water coming down, it's going to increase the salinity. So that can affect the productivity of those breeding grounds. So once again, when you're thinking about biology and you're thinking about different kinds of organisms, everything is a domino effect. There's not usually just one consequence to one action. It's very widespread. The oceans, because they're so vast, we really need to look at some different areas. The intertidal or shoreline area, the coastal areas, the coral reefs, the open ocean, and of course the very bottom. So I want to take a look at just some of these different levels in some of the deeper waters. Let's start with the just zonation we might find in lakes. And one of the first things I would do as I looked at a diagram like this, or I thought about a lake, is I would first look at the photic areas and the aphotic areas, the parts that are receiving sunlight versus the parts that aren't, because that's going to be a basis of your feeding structure and the kind of life forms that you're going to find and relationships you're going to find in those areas. So in the photic areas where you have primary producers that are able to photosynthesize, you can build your feeding structure that way. But in the aphotic areas, then you're going to rely on heterotrophic activities only, where they're feeding upon or decomposing material that's already been produced. When you also look at the areas of a lake, you see the littoral zone, which is close to the shore, relatively shallow. There's even ability of rooted plants in the bottom to be able to get enough light to be able to live. But out in the limnatic zone, that's going to be just floating, probably phytoplankton kinds of organisms. The benthic zone, which extends all the way from the shore to the deepest part, is where there is a lot of decomposing and decaying matter, and you might think that it's very unproductive, but really a tremendous amount of recycling of nutrients occurs in these areas. Sometimes lakes are categorized as oligotrophic or eutrophic, and oligotrophic are the kinds of lakes that are usually very deep, very clear, but they have a lot less nutrient contained in them. Eutrophic are usually shallower and more photosynthetic activity as far as algae are concerned in their water. Lakes also, especially deeper lakes, have a stratification of temperatures. And this is one of those good times to kind of get some interest going with your students and think about the fishermen that are in your class, because a knowledge of the temperature of lakes also helps them with knowing where to find the fish, what kind of bait to use, etc. In the summertime, you're going to have a stratification where the upper surface or the upper part of the lake, the epilimnon, is warmer than the bottom, which is the hypolimnon. There'll be a zone in between called the thermocline where there's a pretty drastic difference in temperature. You may have been even swimming in a lake in the summer and the surface water is pretty warm and you swim out a little deeper and you can even sometimes dive down and feel that very radical temperature difference that you find in the water. As the seasons change and the top layer begins to cool off as we approach fall, that water becomes more dense and begins to sink, and you get a fall overturn. The fall overturns are real important because you get a mixing of oxygen. Colder water really holds oxygen better than warmer water, so you not only recycle the oxygen within the lake, but you also bring the nutrients and circle those around in the lake. So it's a very important phenomenon that happens in these lakes. When we get to winter, it may be surprising to you to know that water at 39 degrees is the most dense. Ice, of course, is less dense than just liquid water, and it floats, kind of making an insulating barrier. And helps to preserve some of the oxygen below, and also helps to maintain the temperature a little bit for organisms to overwinter. As that ice thaws and reaches 39 degrees, because it's so dense, it begins to sink, and that sets off your spring turnover. So once again, I think it's important to tie this in with maybe people's natural interest in fishing or what happens in lakes at different times of the year. They may even notice sometimes in the fall or that spring turnover that may be a little smelly from some of the nutrients that are recycling, some of the decomposition that's going on. The zonation in a marine environment, a lot of times it kind of relates to what we saw in the lakes as far as the photic zone and the aphotic zone where we have light and don't have light. But one thing that we have in a marine environment is that intertidal zone, which is a pretty harsh zone to try to live in as an organism because it goes through periods of dryness and periods of being underwater. So, and plus just the wave action. So it takes a very specialized kind of adaptations to live in that intertidal zone. The neritic zone is a productive zone. It lies over the continental shelf, so it's fairly shallow, and then that opens into the open ocean. And you're going to find, as a rule, more life in the neritic zone than you do in the actual open ocean. Again, we have a benthic zone, which is where a lot of decomposition goes on, and it's a fairly diverse ecosystem that lives in that zone. Since feeding relationships are the basis of ecosystems, we need to look at primary production. We're not, say humans and other kinds of animals are not able to produce organic materials on our own from sunlight. That's only the plants, the photosynthetic bacteria. And so we need to look at that gross primary production. And the photosynthetic organisms, as the sun comes in, it might surprise you to know that generally only capture about 1% of that available energy. And the plant in turn is going to use a lot of what it captures for maintenance and growth and accumulation of biomass. And there's also a tremendous amount of heat loss that goes in that process. So once we kind of establish the gross primary production, we need to, the bottom line as far as other organisms as consumers needs to know what's the net amount, what's accumulated as biomass that can be passed on. And that's only about 10% of what they originally captured from the sunlight. The most productive terrestrial areas are tropical rainforest, least productive desert. In aquatic ecosystems, the most productive are the reefs and the estuaries. Least productive is the open ocean. So as this energy is passing through ecosystems, it goes from producer to consumer to decomposer and recycles again. The producers use the sunlight to power their ability to take these nutrients which are in a limited supply, and to recycle them back again into the feeding relationship. When you look at feeding relationships, a lot of times we talk about trophic levels, and a trophic level is made up of all of the organisms that share the same number of energy transfers. So if originally plants on a first trophic level or producers originally bring in 1% of what they can capture from the sunlight and only can pass on 10% to the next level, and that second level can only pass on 10% of what it captures to the third level, you begin to see why food chains are not unlimited, usually only 3 or 4 steps before you simply are running out of available energy and you've got to start over again. So we can look at this and demonstrate this graphically by the use of ecological pyramids. And when we look at, for example, a pyramid of energy, which is what I've been talking about as far as the amount of energy we capture from the sun and pass on, you can see that that can never be inverted, that you have to have that the amount of energy required at the bottom to support the top is much greater, especially when we're talking about being able to only pass on 10% of the available energy to each level. We can also look at this from a standpoint of just general biomass, and a lot of times it's going to follow the same general pyramid shape, wide at the bottom, narrow at the top. But some of these pyramids of biomass can actually be inverted. Let's think about an aquatic situation where you have a big group of phytoplankton, and because their reproductive cycle is so short and so quick, they can actually reproduce and be consumed by a larger standing crop of zooplankton, and so that and because they completely replenish themselves, you actually get sort of an inverted. At any one time when you measure, the number of phytoplankton is smaller than zooplankton, but because their reproductive rate is so much faster, they're still able to support that bigger population. So that's why you would see that kind of situation. So let's look at what we're recycling in these chemical elements. Remember that they're in limited amounts. We often don't remember this. We think that it's just an unlimited supply, but they are limited. So let's look at some of these biogeochemical cycles that we look at. Remember that as we feed, as we build bodies, we pass it to, we gather things from the environment, we pass to other organisms, and we continually shift between organisms and the environment. And the examples that I have today are the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the carbon cycle. In the water cycle, the water, of course, is indispensable. Organisms are primarily made of water, and also water is a source of hydrogen, which generates ATP that powers all of our metabolic reactions that go on in the body. So we can't do without water. It's essential. And the movement of water primarily involves physical processes of changing from gas to a liquid state, the sun powering the evaporation, and then the resulting precipitation. So those are physical processes. But we also involve the biological process of transpiration in plants. So you want to remember that this is a cycling process. Kind of an example I can give you to drive this home is think about the rainforest. The rainforest really kind of create their own precipitation. They have so much water tied up in their biomass, and they return a tremendous amount of this water back into the environment through the process of transpiration, which in turn comes back to them through precipitation. Now, if you go in and you strip out a big section of the rainforest and you take away the plant mass, as it rains, the water runs off and is basically lost to that particular area or that ecosystem. And so you can actually go from a very wet, moist area to almost a semi-arid desert type area in those situations by taking away that biomass. So once again, everything in nature is not without repercussions. There's always a cascading effect. The nitrogen cycle, all living things are dependent upon proteins and amino acids, which nitrogen is the basis of. It's available almost entirely by the action of bacteria. You know, bacteria get a bad rap. We always think of them in terms of disease, but bacteria are very important decomposers, and they're very important in the conversion of nitrogen. Our atmosphere is primarily nitrogen, but yet as we breathe it in and out, we can't do anything with it as an organism. Instead, it's up to the bacteria to convert that atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia, which joins with hydrogen to create ammonium. And again, we depend on bacteria to convert that to nitrates, which are picked up by producers, passed on to consumers. It decomposes. Some of that's passed back into the chain, and some of it is passed back to the atmosphere by denitrifying bacteria. So bacteria are a very essential part of the nitrogen cycle. The carbon cycle, carbon is, you find it in the oceans, you find it in the atmosphere, you find it in terrestrial biomass and in the bodies of organisms, but it's based on primarily carbon dioxide through the activities of bacteria, protists, and plants. We create organic compounds, those organisms, through their photosynthetic activity, and they pass that on to other organisms through the trophic relationships. Then it's returned back to the atmosphere through respiration, through combustion, and also through erosion. Some of these carbon compounds are resistant and can be retained as fossil fuels, which of course we use, and we're returning those at a faster rate than what nature intended, and so we're upsetting the balance in many cases. That was a quick look at some of your basic biogeochemical cycles. I want to close with just a general suggestion of a biogeochemical activity that you might do with your students. And you could do this before, you could do it after, depending on their content level and where you are with them. But you can pass out untitled diagrams of these cycles and without the labels. And first of all, have them identify which cycle is which based on what's going on. This is another way of getting them to think about things in terms of just memorizing all the parts and looking for key words, but looking at the process and beginning to figure out what's going on. Many times when they do that, they move from memorization to understanding. You can provide a list of labeling terms after they've identified them and see if they can create labels. It's a good way to assess and see where they are, where the holes are in their own learning, so that they can begin to move from just memorization to understanding. Thank you very much.